Guys, please take the seats over there.
The chair is yours.
Tanishka, are we online on Zoom as well?
Yeah.
Great.
Recording in progress.
We have some participants also, some people who wanted to attend from different parts of the country. So we've also arranged for a Zoom session for them. Thank you all, everyone. First and foremost, welcome to Iram Art Gallery. And thank you for taking the time out of your schedules and being present over here for this session. So every show that we do at Iram, it's crossed with a learning program. The learning program has workshops, lectures, talks, and a bunch of other initiatives to kind of further examine or better examine whatever curatorial thematic idea that we're trying to work with at that particular point of time. The previous exhibition was on art and perceptions. We had neuroscientists, we had artists, we had philosophers coming and taking sessions. This particular show, we are examining ideas around post-human philosophy, a very, very niche, a very, very specific area within post-human philosophy, which tries to understand futures of cultural production. It tries to understand futures of ideas of art, design, architecture, specifically to do with notions of skill, specifically to do with notions of community, especially in a time when we are surrounded by computers, artificial intelligence, so on and so forth. Today's session, which is titled Looking Back for the Future, essentially builds on that particular principle and idea. And we're very happy to have Tanishka, Kachru from NID and Mr. Aniket, Bhagwat from Landscape India, who very, very graciously agreed to come here. I'll try and give a very, very short introduction to a very large body of work that they've amassed over the years. Mr. Bhagwat is one of the sharpest minds in architecture and landscape from India. His work, both as an academic and practitioner, has touched many lives. He guides the process of conceptualization and execution of all the commissions at his studio, Landscape India. He believes that every space must be designed to tell narratives and challenge the conventional notions associated with any design typology. He's been deeply involved in academics since 1985 and has led studios in landscape architecture, and interior design. He now utilizes the same principles of teaching and knowledge creation with LEAF, the foundation and the research arm of landscape, and guides the various projects, outreach documents that the foundation undertakes. Ms. Kachru is a senior design faculty at NIT. Her academic background is in architecture and design histories. Recent publications of Ms. Kachru include the staging of the Indian national identity through exhibitions, 1850 to 1947, in Penny Spark and Fiona Fisher's The Rutledge Companion to Design Studies, Nakashima at NID and by NID Press, Contemporary Reflections on NID History, Teaching Through Design, archived in the Bauhaus Imaginista Journal. Her upcoming book, The Rutledge Handbook of Craft and Sustainability in India, is co-edited with Rebecca Rubins and is out for pre-order on the Rutledge website. Prior to her current role at NID, she was also working as an assistant curator at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. Before I begin with any question, I was going through this fascinating landmark exhibition on Indian philosophy and architecture and environment, which was titled The Vistara. It was part of the Festivals of India project and enterprise. I'll just read out some excerpts from Charles Correa's introductory essay to that particular exhibition, and then we can kind of move on to the questions. He says, in Vedic times, that circle is the cosmos itself, and man's central concern is to define himself and his actions in relation to it. Thus, even the buildings he constructs are models of the cosmos, no less. They are generated by magic diagrams called Vastu Purusha Mandalas. These represent energy fields, the center of which is simultaneously both shunya, nothing, and bindu, the source of all energy. A truly mind-blowing concept, astonishingly similar to the black holes of the contemporary physics. Later, with the arrival of Europeans, the context changes yet again. The circle becomes the age of reason, and its concomitants, rationality, science, technology. Perhaps today, as we reach the end of the 20th century, the circle is changing once more. In the West, the myths of technology and progress are being replaced by a concern for the environment, for ecology. Man's thoughts, actions, and architecture will change to reflect this, and a new vistara will open up. In each successive metamorphosis, the human aspect of Purusha seems to stay constant. This is vividly exemplified in the habitat which he builds for himself, using a vocabulary and a syntax that seems immutable. So this is something that kind of triggered us also at various points through the exhibition while we were working on it, talking to artists, talking to academics and researchers. To kind of, go further from here, sir, my first question would be to you. Your approach to design has always fascinated me as a young student at Baroda in the art history department, and even years before that. What I find exciting about your work is how you use nature itself as form. How you almost, it seems to a viewer that you're building with nature. How did this process essentially come about?
So I think, at a personal level, it's changed greatly since the 80s when I first joined and started working. And in that time, of course, we were blown by the winds of modernism in the city more than in India for sure. And the idea of reason, the idea of the rationale being something that we thought was very important. To a certain extent, while modernism itself was a reaction to another movement which was more about ornamentation, arts of a certain kind of decorative arts, the reason that it wanted to exact on Indian minds is something that I found always very difficult to fathom. Here was a society that is the society that we know it, and it's so many different things, and sometimes cacophonic, but underlying it all seems to be one way of looking at the world that seems to hold it together. And on the other hand, here was somebody telling us about a very clinical way of looking at the idea of reason. And I somehow never understood this. And for me, cacophony was good. Multiple elements was good. Multiple things were good. And because I also trained as a landscape architect, it also very quickly taught me that it didn't matter how much was the will of the man. Finally, nature will do what nature will have to do. And all you can do is begin to step back and create space for nature to enact its drama. And I think slowly changed. In the early days, I think one was very scared of trying certain things because you knew that you would fail. Of course, one did fail. But with some degree of skill that it started occurring, you started realizing that if you start trusting ideas of nature, they reward you always. And it requires, I think, a certain degree of humility above all, a sense of empathy. But I think the greatest thing that it demands is truthfulness. Truthfulness to yourself, and the idea of truth outside the ordinary definitions of being truthful. The idea of how can you be truthful about every little act that you are trying to realize, either on paper or then on the ground. I think that changed things. So, I think that's the way that the process happened. I don't think that there's a very clear and distinct way of defining it.
Sure. Just to kind of prompt further on that, how do you tackle with ideas of Uh, so let me rephrase that. Once you kind of look at the site, once you look at the space, of course there are already so many elements, natural and maybe otherwise also in those spaces. How do you tackle the challenges of maintaining ecological balance, not disrupting it, or maybe at times also consciously disrupting it, because at the end of the day there are people who are going to live there. So how do you, if maybe you could maybe cite an example of.
Well, I mean, there's several examples, and I think for each kind of work and each kind of project, there's a different kind of biodiversity or ecological process that you need to set in.
Yes.
Some, of course, require, because they're used by a lot of people, some require a high degree of taking care of, and some, well, can take care of themselves. Or even if the human being intervenes in it, you're beginning to create different paths in a manner in which there are points where both can meet, but where they meet, there's a different kind of energy that gets created, but otherwise they can both subsist and live in that zone, pretty much doing what they need to do. I think you have to be very careful, because I think from a project to project, the definition begins to change, and large ecological projects require a certain kind of action. Dense, habited public park in the city, for example, will require a very different set of actions. I think over a period of years, you've learned how to create compositions that egg people who are invested then with taking care of it, to build a culture of taking care of these things. And I think the area of inculcating that culture is fairly critical in the act of making this work. Yeah.
Can you give an example of such a?
So, for example, many years back, my father worked on a quarry which was 200 acres, and this was a basalt quarry, and he worked on it for about 8 years and converted what was really a barren, devastated basalt quarry into a forest. This happened in the mid-80s. It belonged to an industrial house in Baroda, and they had bad circumstances, and so they had to sell it to somebody else, and people from the studio still go there, and then they sold it further to somebody else. So it's already changed 3 hands now. And with everything that's happening in the country, every time I go there or somebody goes there, one wonders why they're not monetizing this at all, because it's 200 acres, it's got a beautiful lake, beautiful forests, and wonder why they're not putting a bunch of cottages and beginning to rent it out. And most surprisingly, it doesn't matter that owners have changed 3 times. It's not as if the third owner has the same allegiance as the people who created it in the first place. And their answer has always been, this is one place that nature should be allowed to be, and so we will step back. And that's amazing.
Yes.
These are quarry owners. They are mining stone every day, and they seem to find this value, and I find this amazing. And I keep asking myself, why does it happen? And I think there's something in us, there is some genetic code that seems to be embedded in us that wants that life to live, or wants these lives to live. And call it the selfish gene, call it the survival, call it some embedded stuff that's happening in our body and passed on for centuries. I don't know what it is. But there's something about us that wants other lives to coexist. So that project is one, and then on the other hand, in Ahmedabad, we recently restored the Victoria Gardens, which is on the other side of the river, and 125-year-old garden completely devastated, and then being done. Everybody said, better be careful. It's a public park. You can't sort of do dense planting. You can't do mixed planting. You can't do this. We said, well, let's see what happens. And I go there and I see the way people use that park. I mean, it's wonderful. Nobody tramples on the plant. Nobody plucks flowers. And you wonder why people are doing this. And I think, and this is what I said when I started the idea of honesty. If you do something with honesty, somehow the echoes of it seem to rest in that piece of land, and somehow people hear it. I mean, that's the only illogical way to explain it. There is no logical way to explain it. So, yeah.
I think talking about embedded and embodied ideas, Tanishka, I will come to you, especially what he spoke about in terms of, there are certain things that are culturally so, they're being passed on so much, and one can use various terms for that. How do you understand, or how do you articulate the whole situation of crafts within the Indian context from, let's say, independence to now, or maybe a little before that as well? Because these are very distinct timelines, and they've fundamentally impacted what in the way in which we kind of approach the crafts now. I'm sorry, I'm going on a rant, but again, like, because both of us have you teach at NIT, I've taught at NIFT, and we understand the bureaucracy around crafts. So how do you look at this entire thing?
Wow, that's a really big question. Yeah, you're absolutely right. There are so many different kinds of discourses around this idea of craft, and this idea wouldn't exist without the Industrial Revolution, because the minute you move from handmade to machine-made kind of production, you then create this binary, right? That the handmade is now known as craft, right? Handcraft, handmade, whatever you may have it. So this binary really comes to us from this kind of modern capitalist, world that is in making in the 18th and 19th century. And there is, right from the beginning, there are these, one set of people who are saying, oh, it's dying, it's dying, it's dying, we have to save it, right? You've heard that.
Yeah.
There are people who want to save it, preserve it, and then there are these people who are, and who have for millennia just been making things, and they continue making things, and at some point somebody comes along and says, oh, let's scale that up. So this idea of scalability, which is again something which underpins this capitalist modernism, right? That it has to be scaled up, and the modernist is somebody who's looking at things from an overview, from the top. So you'll see in a lot of these, the kind of films and the kind of drawings that architects were doing in the early 20th century, the modernists, they were just, creating these utopian and things that could be seen from the top. And when you look at, the world's fairs, they always had, and these big, what we today recognize as the expos. There was an expo in Dubai and in 2020, and now there will be another one soon. And they always had these, kind of monorails or something that took you really far up, and you can look at everything below. So it was like, oh, this is the amazing creation of our technology and our industrialization, and which is what modernity is really about. And slowly this kind of scenario, craft, kind of gets left behind. But as you said, in our context, and Vistara also, the exhibition kind of foregrounds this. I feel that it didn't because of the fact that we had gone through this colonial kind of experience and the anti-colonial kind of movement, which actually which Gandhi crafted literally, as a resistance, where craft and spinning and the charkha becomes the visual symbol of this resistance. It gave a very kind of a very alternative kind of meanings and multiple meanings to these ideas of craft. But when it comes to independence, we do see very serious efforts in how can we scale it, how can we monetize it, how can it actually help in development. So that kind of urge to see it again as something that would solve those problems of livelihood and feeding the starving millions and the population issue. That feeling has always been there. But when today, when you think about it, and it still exists, go here, there is the whole developmental kind of sector where crafts as something that is about livelihood is still there. But I feel that we're also taking a turn towards what I think can be called artisanal innovation, and this is where the boundaries are kind of blurring, where it doesn't really matter whether you're an artist, a designer, an architect, or a traditional so-called craftsperson. But the fact that you can actually deeply look at a practice, an embodied practice, a craft, a materiality, and that can be innovative, and a kind of the way we think about futuristic innovation is something that's really emerging now. I can see you agree with me or not.
No, fully agree with you. I mean, just to add to it, I mean, when many years back, we built this thing in Delhi which was the Devi Art Foundation building, right? And that in those days, Gurgaon was still happening, and when you went, you hated Gurgaon, at least I hated it. And, very clearly didn't want to look at it. And yet, this was Lekha's building, and, one knew the kind of person that she was. And it had to be a modern building. And we literally decided to build a building and wrapped it up with cotton steel. We used to look at Gurgaon, but then we said it's a modern building that meets Indian craft. And and that's what something, and I said these modernists who came to the country just didn't understand Indian craft. I mean, they did concrete exactly the same way that they did it in Europe, they built bricks exactly the way that they did it in Europe. In India, you can bake your bricks, you can make 20 different kinds of bricks, you can do concrete shuttering at a kind that nobody can even dream of doing. And it really was for us the beginning of trying to understand how do you look at what you're calling artisanal craft, or I call it urban crafts, and to basically there's great skill. How do you begin to sort of plug it with slightly the modernist way of production and see what begins to happen? That's been very interesting. So
Yeah, so what I'm also trying to say is that not to see, so what has happened over this century or whatever, 2 centuries, is that this idea that science and technology is where innovation happens, is something that is now, we can counter. And I think many of the innovative ideas can come from, practice, which is either handmade or artisanal, or, deals with materiality. And I think, both artists and scientists actually engage very deeply with, with ideas, with concepts, with materials. They really look at things deeply, and therefore both have this capacity of, looking at a part, but yet considering implications for the whole. And I think that's really something that both artists and scientists bring to the table.
Do you also think, because we're talking about this idea of skill again, because skill is one of the most discussed ideas right now in terms of even policy, whether one is looking at UN, whether one is looking at Indian government or a lot of these other governments. Do you think that there is this idea of community aspect to skill, especially that crafts have, especially that indigenous communities have, whichever part of the world they're in? Do you think policy is managing to kind of do good or do more harm to it? Especially considering, like, let's just begin from nomenclature itself, right? The whole idea of calling something handmade, you have the handloom and handicraft board, and they literally reject anything that doesn't fall under the categorization, and then leaves no room or space for any of these other innovations, artisanal innovations.
Absolutely, yeah, you're absolutely right. I think this whole skilling India, it's sort of kind of, in a way, the logic is that India has this demographic dividend of this very young, sort of a large youth population, and how do we actually kind of support, but also bring that into the job market in different ways. So all these skills-based programs actually, they address a lot of skills, but there's a limitation when it comes to skills which are to do with handcrafts, or and then and as you said, certification is a huge problem for many. So for example, I'll give you an example. Now NID in the 1970s was working in Rajasthan, that the famous Jawaja case study. In case anybody doesn't know, it was actually a project initiated by the IM director at that time, who was not director, Ravi Mathai. So he had been the first director, and then he was, went back to being a faculty member, and he had time on his hands. And he looked at the census and he said, okay, this is the poorest district of the country, and it's right next to actually where we are. This is Biawar district in Rajasthan. And he said, so we have this great management school and we have this, design school. What can we do together to improve the lives of the poorest people in the country? Is there something that our skills, these new modern skills can help with? And today, Jawaja is seen as a success story. You can buy the iconic bags at Fab India, but they also have an export market. But at the same time, when they are not seen as traditional handcraft, and they cannot get that certification. So that's the irony of it.
Yeah.
Here is something that was very innovative, it's recognized through the world, most of us, admire it, but the government refuses to recognize it.
I have a question for you, sir, on this, because you mentioned that we can come up with 20 different kinds of bricks, right? So again, these are very, very pertinent skills. Again, going back to the whole conversation of skills, these are very pertinent skills. In terms of academics, or in terms of maybe again policy, or what are the ways in which one kind of ensures that a lot of these skills do manage to survive? I'll give you an example. So we're trying to do something at our farm, which is in a very, very barren area altogether. And we were talking to somebody, and they mentioned the whole idea of, I think, a Jaipur well or Jodhpur well or something of that sort. And we went about, so it's a very interesting well, because it's extremely porous, and it retains a lot of water and all of that. We tried to go out looking for people who could do that for us, who could build that for us. And it's a challenge, because you barely come across people who are able to do it. So these are things that are kind of being lost to the tides of time, so to say.
Well, I would say that the last 10-15 years actually has seen a renaissance of many of the olden ideas finding root. For example, earth construction, which 20 years back was something that was limited to Auroville and one more place. Now suddenly, you've got any number of kids wanting to do it. You've got any number of, the other day, we were looking at something in Bangalore, a bunch of kids who were really doing earth plasters, earth paints, earth floors. A lot of old flooring techniques are being revived. So I think that there is some serious revival of old skills. And I certainly do believe that all of these people are very smart so they understand that, how do we use this skill and make it work in a context that has not changed. So I'm actually quite hopeful at the level and the enthusiasm that one is seeing. So I'm sure something will slip by, and one's well may not happen.
Of course.
But in general, my sense is that there's a great faith, a great revival. There's an organization in Bombay, and I'm missing the name, and there's a bunch of kids, and you can tell them any region in the country, virtually, and they will send their people, and they will stay in that region for months, and they will map everything in that region, from the culture to the craft to the materiality to whatever. They'll take soil samples, they'll test soil samples, they'll find minerals, and they'll finally give you a resource book of that region. Now, 20 years back, I don't think anybody was even talking about doing things like this. And the very fact that they can survive today and get these kind of commissions in Sikkim and Rajasthan and wherever else that they're trying, is that we surely are asking the right questions, right? At the very least, we're asking the right questions. Are we coming up with the right answers? I think there is a problem, right? And that problem has more to do with ideas of capitalism, ideas of politics, ideas of what we call success, and so on and so forth. But do I believe that a lot of people are asking the right questions? I think the answer is yes.
All right.
Without any doubt, yeah.
And just a closing question to a few. You mentioned a project, you mentioned this collective out of Bombay. Uh, any particular, example or case study which you feel like completely, made you more hopeful for the future?
Oh, everything makes me more hopeful. That's the way to live. No, I'm very hopeful. I don't know where we started this conversation with the assumption that you're not hopeful. I am always hopeful.
Yeah.
If I'm not, then it ends. So, no, I'm always hopeful, and then every day that I come across something that puts a smile on my face. So, yeah, no, I think, no, I think there is reason to be very hopeful. I don't know what you meant by, what do you call it, post-human future?
Yeah.
And I find that a difficult term.
Post what?
Post-human futures.
So I find that a very difficult. But just by an aside, I mean, you read Donna Haraway, right?
Yeah.
So Donna Haraway, for those who haven't, is of course somebody who has written extensively on artificial intelligence, and all the books are about machine learning, artificial intelligence, and so on and so forth. And Donna Haraway actually comes across and says that there's a need to end the Anthropocene, and there is a need to start something that she calls the Chutlucene, which really means you find meaning, you convince yourself, or you teach yourself, whichever is the way, that every animate and animate object in this world has the power to influence decisions, right? And the moment you start thinking like that, even for a moment you suspend your belief a little bit, the world changes. I mean, then you're walking onto a piece of land and you see a piece of rock and you're saying, you're taking decisions as much as I'm taking decisions, and can we get talking about this? You begin to see the world very, very differently, and I think that's what's required. I think this overt exercise on post-human, pre-human, it's scary, but yeah.
All right, Tanishka, you're close.
Yeah, I'll go back to my favorite anthropologist, Anna Ching, and she has this wonderful book called The Mushroom at the End of the World, where she traces, and she talks about the entire world kind of we live in through her very deep investigation of this mushroom, which has a very important cultural significance for Japanese people, and it's found in Japan but also in Oregon apparently, and it kind of actually flourishes where what we would call kind of destructive kind of ways of plantation, or there's also this concept of the plantation of seed. So, but but this mushroom, so to see every act not just as something that kind of ends or creates a full stop, but is an opening for another way of world making, which is what Aniket was also saying, that the rock, the mushroom, there can be other ways of making the world and collaborating with non-human actors within that ecology. So the mushroom at the end of the world actually, flourishes in these places which we see as maybe in the current paradigm as spaces which are where we have destroyed things, but even there, so it's a beautiful kind of actually way of thinking about this idea of hopeful futures, and not losing that kind of hope.
Thank you so much, the two of you. We can open up for Q&A if somebody has any questions.
I would love to know more about the relationship of the scientist and the artist.
The scientist and the artist. I'm sure there must be lots of wonderful couples. But
I have to think about that one.
What I was referring to, I guess, was that the way that scientists very deeply and in a focused way investigate something at a very sort of micro level. The artist also has the capacity to do that, right? And in doing that, both have a way of. But when you look at the work of art, the kind of meanings that you make may have implications for the whole, but it comes from that very deep investigation of small micro parts, and both scientists and artists have that way of working.
And architects.
Something that I've been watching recently and I just mentioned is a wonderful show on Apple TV called Lessons in Chemistry.
Oh yes, yeah.
Have you watched that?
I read the book.
It's very nice show and I recommend it.
I read the book and I got to the point where that the scientist dies.
Yes.
And I was like, oh, and I was on a holiday. That I was like, oh, what a depressing book to read now.
It's a wonderful show.
But there was something in there that made me pick it up again.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's you're right. The scientists coming together
Yes.
with doing how that kind of the meaning it has in our everyday life.
Anybody else? Any questions?
I don't have a question, but I have just some kind of a statement query. We thank you both for fabulous conversation. There's something about this idea of hope, no hope. I think these are sort of black and white spaces. There are two things. One is that we don't really talk when you talk about policy. Policy can be, instigated even from the private sector. But we are not actually focusing on the need of government to be proactive in keeping the independence of the artisan alive. What we tend to do is we have actually subsumed them into systems that are within this capitalist space. So, places like Gurjari and things like that, we kind of completely took them over and made them into kind of puppets for what we thought would be. And even our festivals of India, though I have great respect for Pujagar and Rajiv Sethi, without doubt, but still, we sort of subsume them. The second thing we're not actually bringing into focus is that our educational systems, NID included, much as I have respect to my son studying there, and many, faculty of fine arts and all of them, we don't actually understand the coexistence of the artisan or the practice of that which is outside of the city and that which is what we call the urban space of interaction. This is something that has remained a huge chasm and a huge divide right from, let's say, independence onwards. And I think that there lies our problem, So we're patronizing in the way we look at these things.
I'm so glad you brought that point up. There's Arindam Datta, again a SECT grad, has written a fantastic book called The Bureaucracy of Beauty. And again, a lot of these ideas and a lot of these challenges within the entire, the entire, what is that, BSA, the British, I keep forgetting the name, I've become horrible with names. So within that entire way in which the academia, the museum, and then finally the policy was kind of brought together, he kind of begins from there, and he actually then elaborates exactly on what you spoke of. So I think and that's also the biggest challenge with policy today. And the worst, I just don't put this anywhere else, I don't want to. But the worst is the case of khadi actually. So the irony is that the weaver cannot call the cloth khadi, although it is khadi, cannot call the cloth khadi unless and until the government has given him the license to call it khadi.
I want to talk about pure, simple economics of survival.
Yeah.
All of us are sitting here today because we have a survival that is based on an economy that we can actually sustain for ourselves.
Yes.
And that is from the privilege of education or whatever else.
Yes.
We're not actually going to that grassroots level. When we're talking about innovativeness, how can you be innovative when you're starving? That's something that is ludicrously important.
I think a lot of the critique about policy comes, we do a good job of, sort of being critical about implementation. But in terms of its formulation, I think that's where, one has to really look at, inclusion, equity, how are these kind of fairness, how are these addressed to actually recognize what you're saying, that the diversity that we have of, it's not just the skilled people who are working in these workshops where, all that so-called handicraft production, which is for the export market or the urban market is being done, But there are so many different diverse conditions in which crafts are happening, and the policy formulation actually does not.
I honestly don't think policy. I mean, in the sense that what is the kind of policy that you expect any government to create? And we've seen what they've done over the last 40, 50 years. You put yourself in their shoes and say, okay, fine, what would you do, right? You would afford some kind of protection. What would that protection mean? You would have given them access to markets. What would those markets mean? I mean, I don't see a possible policy solution to this. Because I think many policies have been tried over many, many years, and some have worked, some have not worked, some newer centers have come up and have done very well, some have failed, and that's the way. But finally, it's about, do they have a market to begin with? I mean, at the end of the day, it's going to boil down to that. Do they have somewhere where their goods are accepted? And if their goods are not accepted, then do you put them on dole, which is even worse? So, I think it's complex. I think things will die. Some of them, like we lose animals and birds every year, and they get extinct. Some will go, and that is the nature of the world. And some will evolve and morph and find a new way of living. But to try and fossilize, I mean, yes, you can record them, for sure. And you must do everything that you can, but you can't create sanctuaries for them, right? So, what is it that you're going to do?
So my thing is not that. I completely agree with you. My thing is that if you don't create an infrastructure where you have water, sanitation, educational spaces, we can't get to the next level. When people are running away from spaces because there is nothing for them there. I'm not talking about policy. I mean, I'm not part of these kind of spaces where I can even intervene on that. Leave that word out. It's how you create actual progress. Progress is about, not campaign strategy when you show your face in certain sectors because you want to vote back. But it's actually understanding that, we have a huge disparity of urban and rural. And that is what I'm really addressing.
I was shocked to find out, I gave you the example of the Javaja, experiment, and which is kind of, you could look at it economically and say that, oh, they're doing well, they're flourishing and all. But I found that there were some students from IIM Indore who did a case study of social impact, and it's only 10 years ago that that group of people, who work with leather, so therefore, dead animals, or with, the rug weaving, were given access to the village well, right? And 70s se intervention chal raha hai, but the access to the, so, in terms of the social impact of these.
But Rekha, my sense is that if one actually, and you would know a lot better than this, but my sense is that if one were to quickly look at which are the initiatives that have worked and which are the initiatives that haven't worked, my sense is 9 out of 10 times you're going to find a private individual who has decided to invest his or her life in that particular geography and then work with the people and bring them together and look after them. And Tina Archana's book talks about so much about the one that she's traveled all over and found these sort of cooperatives all over the country for textile in particular. And I think that's what will work. I mean, that's what I'm saying. The policy should be that the government should not get involved. That to me should be the policy. Wherever they don't get involved, I think things work. So
They haven't got involved for years.
no, they have. They've been writing all the policy every day.
But one interesting experience I've had is that not these skill programs, but the Ministry of Minority Affairs, this Ustad scheme, जिसमें both NIFT and NIM involved. And so that was actually framed not as something that was to do with livelihood, but as something that was looking holistically at the kind of knowledge systems and practices that minority communities have, and how do we actually kind of, although it said upgrading the skills and all that, but uske saath, because there was this other kind of framing also, it actually became a really interesting space to bring things together in a much more holistic way and think about, documentation, think about knowledge transfer, what kind of capacities you have to build for that, and not just product development.
Yes.
Right? But how to think about intergenerational knowledge transfer. So sometimes surprising things can happen.
Yeah, I think on that note we could close the session. Thank you so much, everybody. I'd request Tejo to, please come up and give them, thank them with a small token of appreciation. It's a fun book, which is on very, very successful Indian case studies on rural revival, on community revival, on ecological revival. So we end on a very positive note, and the future is positive.
I didn't know we started on a negative.
End on a positive one, so which is why.